Did you know that you can write your own URL path converters in Django applications? We're going to dive in this video and we're going to understand what converters are and also how to use them. We'll look at the built-in ones and then we're going to define our own URL path converter at the end of the video. Now before we get started, if you want to support the Bug Bites channel, check out this Ko-fi page, and thank you very much to everybody that's contributed to this page, and don't forget to like and subscribe as well. So let's get started. We're going to look at the documentation on the URL dispatcher in Django. And we did a previous video on URLs, but we didn't cover this particular topic. And it turns out that Django has a number of path converters built in. And you might not know what these are immediately, but you've definitely used them if you've worked on a large project using Django. So these path converters are something that you use in the URL. And we have 5 built in, including string, int, slug, UUID, and path. And we'll look later in the video at registering our own custom path converters. If we scroll back up, we're going to see an example usage of a URL path converter. So here we have some URL patterns in a Django application. And notice this syntax that we have here. So what this is doing is capturing a dynamic value from the URL, for example, the year. You wouldn't want to create a URL for every possible year that could be in this system. So what you do instead is you create a dynamic value here. And before the colon, we have int. So that's the converter here. It's built into Django, and this is going to capture an integer parameter. And the name of the actual value is going to be passed to the Django view, and in this case, it's called year. So as I've said, you've probably used these in a Django application, but we're going to look at some specific use cases here, and we're also going to look at building our own path converter. So let's look at some examples here, and we're going to open VS Code. I have a project here with a single Django model, and that's the film model. And a film contains a name and a slug, as well as a created@ field. So if you're following along, you can create this model here, and then you can run make migrations and migrate. What we want to do with this film model is we want to create a URL here to expose a detail page for an individual film. Now I've already went and I've populated the database with 3 films. You can see them here on the Django admin UI. So what we want to do is we want to have a page for each individual film. We're going to add a URL for that just now. Let's go back to URLs.py. And we're going to create a new path here, so let's do that just now. And let's give this a URL route of /films, and then we're going to use a dynamic parameter here. And that's because we want to capture the value from the URL, and it's going to be an integer because we're going to look at the primary key in the database. So let's give the captured value a name of pk. And what we can then do is we can write a Django view function here. And I'm going to call this film detail because it's going to be a detail page for the film. And we'll give it that name as well. So the name parameter here is going to be film-detail. Now we can save this and we can go to views.py, and what we're going to do is write the view function now. It's going to be called film detail. It's going to take the Django request object, and we're going to pass through that primary key from the captured URL value. Now at the top here, I'm going to import a couple of things. So we're going to import the get object or 404 function and the film model that we have in our models.py file. And what we're going to do within the view function is we're going to fetch the film from the database, and we're passing that primary key in order to do that. And then we're returning a template here called film.html, and we're attaching that film that we've retrieved from the database to the context. Now I've pre-prepared film.html, so let's have a look at that just now. We're not going to bother too much about the content of these templates. It's just going to render out the name and the slug for that film. So let's save this, and what we're going to do is go back to our application here, and I'm going to go to that URL that we defined. So it was /films, and let's put the dynamic value 1 in the URL here, and we're going to see what we get back. And that is the film The Big Lebowski. That's the one that has the primary key of 1 in the database, and that's using that captured value of 1. And if we pass 2 in here, we get the second film, which is The Godfather, and that's the slug. Now if we change it to something that doesn't exist, for example 242, we get a 404 not found. Now we can also write a detail view using class-based views. So what I'm going to do is go back to views.py, and just underneath this function view, I'm going to paste in some code. So from Django's views generic detail module, we're going to import the detail view class, and then we can create a subclass of that called film detail view. And the model we're using here is the film model, and we link it to the film.html template. What we can then do is go back to urls.py, and instead of referencing the function view, I'm going to remove that. And we can then reference the film detail view, and we need to call the asView function. So I'm going to show examples in this video of how to use different path parameters and different converters in Django. And we're going to show that with normal views, but also class-based views. So if we save this and go back to our application, and let's go back to the number 2 here. If we load up that, we get back the correct response for film number 2, which is The Godfather. So the class-based view knows how to look up this particular film because we're tying it to the film model, and it's expecting a pk argument from the URL. Now, what if you don't want to use the primary key in your URL? So let's go back here and imagine that we wanted to use the name of the film, or potentially the slug for that film would make more sense. Now let's go back to the URLs.py file and we're going to change this here. So instead of an integer as the path converter, we're going to use the string path converter that's built into Django, and let's call this value here name. So now in the function view, the name is going to be passed into the film detail page here. So what we need to do is change the value getting passed in to name, and then we need to reference that in the getObject or 404 function and pass that in. So now we're looking up the film model and we are looking it up by name based on what's in the URL and passed into this Django view function. And this will potentially fetch a film by name, or it might return 404, but because we're not using a primary key in the database, unless you have a unique constraint on this field, this could potentially return multiple films as well, which might cause an error. And you can see that at the bottom here, just like the .get method, multiple objects returned, that exception is going to be raised if more than one object is found using this query. So let's save this, and what I'm going to do actually is move this import up to the very top of the file. Let's paste that in here. And we're going to reference the film detail page in URLs.py. So let's remove the call to the class-based view, and we're going back to film detail. We can then go back to our application, and instead of the number 2 in the URL, we're going to remove that. And I'm just going to type out the Godfather here and see what we get back. And you can see we get back the page. This is now using the name field from that film model to look up the film based on what's in this captured value. And if we change that back to the number 2, this time it's going to give us a 404 not found. Now it's a bit more complicated for a detail view. So let's go back here and we're going to change this back to what it was before. Now we're going to reference the film detail view, which is the class-based view, I should say. And if we go back to views.py, what I'm going to do is just comment out the film detail view. And we're going to use this class-based view now. Now when you create a subclass of the detail view from Django, it expects the lookup for that object to be done using a primary key or a slug field. Now we don't have that, we're looking up by the name field on the model. So if we go back to our application and we change this back to the Godfather, it did work with the function view, but it's not going to work now. And as you can see in the error message, the film detail view must be called with either an object primary key or a slug in the URL configuration. So how do you get this working when you're passing something else? So when you need to look up an object by a different field, we're going to reference this documentation here. I'll leave a link to this below the video. This is the 𝗙𝗂ci class-based views website, an amazing website for Django and working with class-based views. And we're on the page for the detail view here. And what we can do is scroll down and we're going to look at a method here called getObject. So this returns the object that the view is displaying. And it requires self.querySet, and it also requires a primary key or a slug argument in the URL configuration. Now if you want to use something else, what you can do is override getObject, and you can use that to return anything you want, basically. We're going to do that just now, so what I'm going to do is copy the signature of this method, and let's go back to our application, and within the detail view we can paste that in. And we can get the name from the URL using self.quargs, and that's going to give us back a dictionary of all of the keyword arguments passed in, and we can use .get to get the name from that, and that's going to match what we have defined here in the URL configuration. And then once we have the name, we can do the lookup. So I'm going to return a statement here. It's going to be film.objects.get, and let's look up that name field here on the model based on the name that we have in the URL. So now if we go back to our application, beforehand we're getting this error. If we refresh the page, now we get the page for this particular movie. So I wanted to show that example. That's how you can look up any field in a model within a detail view. But of course, because it's expecting to return a single object, it makes most sense in your URL configuration to use either the primary key or some kind of field that has a unique constraint, and that will ensure that you only get back a single object. Now if we look at the models.py file, what about this slug field here? Now it's very good to use a slug in the URL for a number of reasons. So let's have a look at URLs.py, and we're going to change the path converter now to slug, and let's just call the value here slug as well. So we're now going to pass that into the function. So let's go back to views.py, and what I'm going to do is comment this out, and we're going to bring back the function-based view to start with, and this is going to be very easy. We just update the value passed into the method, and we can update the lookup as well to look up the film by the slug. Now of course we need to update urls.py so that we're not using the class-based view, and we're going to use the functional view. Once we've done that, we can then go back to our application, and if we look at this here, I'm going to use the slug version of the Godfather, and that's going to return the correct page. And if we change that to No Country for Old Men, it's also going to return the page for that particular movie. So it's now using the slug, and one of the big benefits of using a slug is that it's good for SEO, and that's search engine optimization. So having something descriptive in the URL such as this here is going to be beneficial for pushing your application up the search results because crawlers can understand better what this means. So when a user comes and searches for No Country for Old Men, it's better to have this in the URL than it would be to have just the primary key of the movie, which I think is 3. And that's going to return a 404 not found, of course, but if we were using the integer primary key as we did at the start of the video, that's not going to give a lot of information to a crawler, whereas actually having the slug with the film's name, that is much better for SEO. Now for the class-based view, this is actually very easy as well, so let's reference that class-based view again and go back to views.py. I'm going to comment out the function view and we can bring this back. And we can actually just get rid of getObject, we don't need that at all. If we save this and go back to the page and refresh this page, and I need to turn this back to the slug here, we're going to get back the right page, and that is all working now with the class-based view as well. So why is that working? Let's go back to this website. There's a property on the detail view, and that's the slug URL _kwarg. Now that's the default, and that is actually what we've used in URLs.py. So if we look here, we've given it a value of slug. If I was to change that to something else, such as sluggy, when we save that and go back to our application, if we refresh this, it's not going to work. So what we need to do here in that case, if you're using a different name, is you need to update this property on the detail view. So let's go back to views.py, and we're going to add that property and set that to whatever we have in the URLConf. In this case, it's sluggy. And if we save that and go back to the application again, we can refresh and we get back the correct page. So we've looked at these path converters and we've looked at how to use them with functional and class-based views. We're now going to move on and define our own custom path converter. So let's go back to VS Code and we're going to create a file here in the core application, and that's going to be converters.py. Now where do we even start here? How do you write a custom converter in Django? If we go back to Django's documentation on path converters, there's a section on registering custom ones. So for complex matching requirements, you can define your own path converters, and that's a class that includes the following attributes. So we have a regex class attribute that you need to define, and that's a string, as you can see on the class below. We also need a toPython and a toURL method. toPython is going to handle converting the string into the type that should be passed into the Django view function, and toURL is a method that's going to handle converting the Python type into a string that can be used in the URL. So we've got this one here, it's called a 4-digit year converter. It's got this regex here, and that's a very simple regex that requires 4 numbers. When we convert that string to Python, all we're doing is we're taking the value and we're calling the int function to convert that to an integer. And for the toURL function, what we're doing is taking that value, and remember the value is an int type in Python, and we're converting that to a string, as you can see here. Now we register custom converter classes in the URL configuration using this function here. So we're going to see an example of that in a second. Now let's assume for our application that we require a date to be in a particular format. We can create a date converter for that, and that's going to be a custom one that we can then use in our URLs. And later on, I'm going to quickly show how you can create, for example, an IP address converter as well for the URL. So whenever you expect a URL to be in a specific format, such as this one here with a year containing 4 numbers, these converters can be useful for converting the raw data to some value that you can then pass into the Django view. And other examples of that are things like dates and times, as well as IP addresses, and even things like social security numbers or geographical coordinates or hashtags. Anything that's expected to come in a specific format, and you want to actually take that and you want to extract the logic to convert that into the correct Python types in a dedicated place, a path converter makes sense for this use case. And this can help keep your views clean and concise as well. So let's now write a date converter for our URLs, and we're going to expect dates in the following format. So let's write a date converter in order to do that. So we're back in VS Code, and at the top here from datetime, we're going to import datetime from the Python standard library, and we're going to create a class here called date converter. Now we need to write a regex for that format. So I'm going to paste the format in a comment just above this regex, and then we define the regex property in the converter class. So that's going to be a string, and we're going to specify that we want 4 digits for the year. We then want the dash, and then we're going to have some more digits, and it's either going to be 1 or 2 digits for the month. And that's how you can express that in a regular expression. It's going to be either 1 or 2 digits, and then another dash here. And same again, we're going to expect 1 or 2 digits for the days. We can then write the 2 methods, and the first one is going to be toPython, and that's going to take self because it's a method, and also the value coming in from the URL, which is going to be a string. And what we're going to return here is we're going to use the datetime.stringParseTime function. And this is going to take a string, and it's basically going to return a datetime, as you can see here. So let's pass the value into that, and we can pass in the format. And the correct format for what we're expecting here is as follows. It's going to be %y, and that's a capital Y, then %m and %d. Now this is going to return a datetime object. To get the date as we want from a date converter, we can use the .date function in order to do that. So all this does is return the date part of a datetime object in Python. So that's the toPython function. We can then write the second function, which is toURL. And again, that's taking self and value as parameters. And this time we want to do the opposite. We want to take a date object and we want to convert that to a string that can be then used in the URL. So this time we're going to return datetime, and what we're going to use is a function called string format time. So strf time. And all we need to do now is copy this format that we have and paste that into this. And if you look at the signature of this, it basically takes in the datetime object and it returns a string. So that's our custom date converter. How do we actually use this in URLs.py? What we can do if we go over to that file is we can register the converter. And the Django.urls module, as well as the path function, has another function that we can use called register converter. And from the current application, as well as the views, we're going to import the converters as well. So let's do that at the top. And we're going to use the register converter function just above the URL pattern. So let's do that. And we can pass some stuff into that. So we're going to use the converters module. And the one that we wrote is called date converter. So that's the converter class. And then we have the type name. So what we can do here is pass in date. Now the type name is what you basically see before the colon in the URL when you're capturing this given value. So now that we've registered the converter, we can actually define URLs that use this date converter. So let's see an example of that now. I'm going to define a new path here, and it's going to be for the route films, and then we're going to have /date. And now we can use the converter. So we're going to use the angle brackets to capture the value, and we're going to give it a name of date as well. And imagine that this URL is going to take in a date and it's going to return all films that were created at that given date. And we can create a new view function here called films_by_date, and let's give that a name as well. So this is the custom converter that we've defined. We're using that now in the URL, and we now have to write the view function. So let's go to views.py, and I'm just going to do this at the bottom here. So films_by_date is going to take the request object. But as well as that, it's also going to take the date that we're passing into this view. Now to get started, I'm going to print the date as well as the type of this date parameter that's being passed in so that we can see that on the terminal. And then we're going to create an ORM statement here. So it's going to be film.objects.filter. And we're going to take the created at field on the model. So if we go to models.py, let's click this just now. We've got a created at field. Now let's imagine this was the date the film was actually released. It's a bit of a contrived example, and notice that this is a date time field as well. But we can go back to views.py, the created at field, we're going to use the date modifier. So that's going to convert the date time to a date object, and we can then check if it's equal to the date that's being passed in from our custom URL converter. And finally, I'm just going to return a template here called film.html, and we're going to attach all of the films that have been found to that context. Now what I'm going to do is expand the terminal, and let's go back to our application now. So we're going to go to the URL films/date, and I'm going to use the current date that I'm filming this video. So it's going to be on the 26th of February 2025. If we execute this, what we get back is not much at all. We've got a dash here, so not the most interesting page. But if we go back to VS Code, notice the print statement here. So we get the date here, and we get the type of what's being passed into the function. So the URL path converter has taken that string from the URL and it's converted it to the date object. Now it turns out this lookup here is not finding any films with a created at date equal to the one that I'm using in the URL. Now the problem that I've got here, if we scroll down, is that I'm using the wrong template. So we're going to change film.html to films.html, and if we look at the left hand side, it's this template here. So it's expecting a context variable called films, and there's a for loop here iterating over each one of them and displaying some details for the film. So let's try this again. I'm going to go back to the browser, and if we refresh this again with the date being set at the top here, we get back all three films because they were all created at this given date. Now if I go to the admin UI and let's change No Country for Old Men to a different date of the 22nd, when we save that and go back to this page, you can see that when we refresh this content, we no longer get No Country for Old Men. If we change the URL parameter to the 22nd, then we do get back that movie, and the reason for that, again, if we go back to VS Code, if we look at URLs.py, we have our date converter being used in the URL. So that's going to use this converter that we've created, this class. It's going to match this regex here, and if there's a match, it's going to convert the string to the Python object. In this case, that's going to return a date object. And then that date is going to be passed as this name here into the view function, which is films by date. So if we go to that function here, you can see it's coming in as a second parameter. And when we print that to the terminal, you can see we get back the date class, that's the type, as well as the date value. So all of that conversion logic can be handled in the path converter, and that helps keep the view function very clean. And then we can do the lookup here, as you can see, and return the correct objects. And if we don't get a date in the URL that matches the value or the regex that we've defined in the converter, then it's not going to try and use this particular path, and it's going to move on to the other paths in the URL patterns. Now you can imagine in converters.py, this toPython method that takes the string and converts it to whatever you need it to be in the Django view. That's useful for conversion to dates, IP addresses, and even geographical objects, for example, creating polygons and stuff like that, latitude and longitude coordinates, and so on. So that's the power of these converters. You can move the logic for converting that string in the URL to these objects into the converter class. Now I just want to finish the video very quickly by showing another example with IP addresses. So what we're going to do is import the IP address module, and that's a fast, lightweight IP4 and 6 manipulation library in Python. And I'm going to paste some code in, so let me minimize the terminal here, and I'm going to remove the sidebar. Just underneath that, we're going to create a new converter class, and it's going to be called IPv4 converter. So we have a regex here, and I'm not going to pretend to have created this myself, but that should hopefully be accurate for an IPv4 address. So when we send an IP4 address in the URL, the toPython method here is going to try and convert that to an IPv4 address object in Python. So it's using this class here from the module that we've imported, and it's passing the value here from the URL into that object. And if there's any errors here, we're going to raise a value error. And to convert the other way from the IPv4 address object back to a string that can be used in the URL, we have the toURL method here, and it's very easy. All we do is pass the value into the string method. Now again, if we go back to urls.py, we can register this converter. So I'm going to copy this line of code to the line below, and instead of the date converter, we can now register our second converter for the IPv4 addresses, and we can give that a given name here. And I'm just going to use IPv4. And I think this has been quite a long video, so I'm just going to paste all of this in and just show this example at the end. So let's create a new path here where we use our new converter. So that's /IPs, and then we have the captured value here, and we're using the converter that we've registered here with this name, and we'll give the value a name of IP. And that's going to then call out to a view called IP address. So let's load up views.py, and we're not going to do anything amazing here. I'm just going to paste some code in, and we need to import the HTTP response from django.http. Once we've done that, all we're doing here is we're printing the IP address to the terminal and also the type, and then we can return that IP address in an HTTP response. Let's now go back to the browser and finally test all of this out. So I'm going to paste in a URL here. So it's localhost 8000/IPs, and then we have this IP address here. If we execute that, we get back the IP address in the response, and we can then go to the terminal. And if I expand this, you can see the value here. And the type of that value that's passed into the Django view is the IPv4 address class. So we have an instance of that class. And that's amazing because we've consolidated all of the logic to convert the string value from the URL into an IPv4 address object inside of that path converter. So just to re-emphasize, this helps keep the views very clean by moving that logic into a dedicated place. And that's the power of writing your own custom converters for different use cases when you have these predefined formats that you expect in your URLs. So that's all for this one on Django converters. You might not define your own one every day that you're using Django, but it's useful to know that this functionality exists, and it also gives you a bit of insight into how the built-in path converters actually work in Django. If you've enjoyed this video and found it useful, check out the Ko-fi page that we've got just linked below the video. And again, much appreciated to everybody that's contributed to this. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, that would also be greatly appreciated. Thanks again, guys, and we'll see you in the next video.